Rebecca is currently working as a consultant to the UN Environment Programme, TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity Agri-Food Programme. She's based in Thailand at the UNEP Regional Office for the Asia Pacific to support the TEEB programme's implementation in Thailand and Malaysia. She's a law graduate with a postgraduate master's degree in environment and development and over 20 years professional experience in development policy research and analysis. Her research work has centered on promoting sustainable livelihoods of low-income communities in developing countries, focusing on agrarian reform and community and smallholder tenure of land and natural resources, and more recently on agri-food policy and addressing environmental concerns within the food system. In addition to working with the UN, she's worked with farmers' organizations and with various local and international NGOs, mostly in the Southeast Asia region, including Myanmar, the Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. Now, Rebecca has said she would like this to be nice and informal, so she's going to speak for about 20 minutes and then is most happy to answer people's questions and really just to inform us whether you know a great deal or less about the issues that she's dealing with, so that we can be informed in our Catholic appropriation of Laudato Si and all the aspects of spirituality and morality that go with that. So Rebecca, thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing everything you have to tell us.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the group for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to try and share my screen, and while I do that, if I could ask somebody to keep some time check as well, just in case I go over time. I'd like to try and go through this quickly. I put together a number of different slides from different talks that I've given. So apologies if this isn't going to answer all of the questions you have or fill you in with everything that we're doing, but I wanted to give you just a brief discussion of the work that I'm doing, how it relates to food systems, and how that might relate to peace and justice issues very, very briefly. But I'm happy to answer questions and discuss more broadly. I'm going to try and put this on full screen. Please let me know if you can see this. You should be able to see a golden field of rice. Yes, okay, good. So I'm going to have to minimize the windows of the people here. So I won't be able to see you as I'm speaking, so please say something if you'd like my attention. So unfortunately, we have to start with a difficult picture, which is that we're really on perilous ground. The environment, as you know, is in crisis, and in particular, alarm sounds have been raised for many decades already. At the moment, the latest is that we're not on track to meet the targets set, and we have expect that with the current trajectory, we're likely to have a temperature rise of over 3 degrees, which is unsustainable. And a lot of the problems come from the food system. So we have many impacts of our current food system today on land, soil, water, pollution. Biodiversity is greatly affected. The figure there says 60% of global terrestrial biodiversity loss is due to the food production systems, but I've seen even higher figures than that. Fossil fuels consume a huge amount within the food system. There's many impacts on the seas, the oceans, and of course on greenhouse gas emissions. We really are in a crisis, and I put there a small indication of the situation facing Thailand over the last 2 years. Has been very, very little rainfall compared to the normal. And I'm not sure that the end of last year's rainy season was particularly strong either. So the figures are not likely to look great this year, but we don't know. We don't have the more up-to-date figure yet. But essentially, we are in a very difficult situation. We need to address the unsustainable food systems as quickly as possible. That's not moving forward. Can you see? Okay. So as you know, you probably know, the UN have set Sustainable Development Goals. So there's 17 of them, and they're on every topic that you can imagine. I just noticed that there's a peace and justice one also, which I have not been focused on. I've been working more on the zero hunger and the environmental goals. But one thing I wanted to share with the group is that these goals, while they're all equally important and essential to focus on, you have to also look at them within a system. And the way we like to look at them is to reconstruct them in this way. So to have the planetary sustainable development goals at the bottom of the system, on which people, dignity and justice goals are dependent, and then the goals of prosperity are dependent upon that. So at the very bottom of this, of all of the sustainable development goals, are the planetary system goals relating to water, climate, land, oceans, and we've got there also sustainable consumption and production. This, for me, helps to see the essential nature of ensuring sustainability at the very, very grassroots at the environment on which we can all thrive, on which we can all have equality, with which we can all have decent work and sustainable cities, etc., etc. Now, these goals include one that is very important for the work that I'm doing, and that is related to integrating ecosystem services and biodiversity into national and local planning. And I mentioned that because this is directly the work that I'm currently engaged in, working with the United Nations Environment Programme, and specifically the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. It's a bit of a mouthful. People have been saying, why didn't you call it the economics of nature, which would have been 10 and would have been a much easier acronym to use. But anyway, TEEB was an initiative that's been around for a decade now. And essentially what we're trying to do is to mainstream the values of ecosystem services and biodiversity into decision-making at all levels. And that's public sector as well as private sector. So we're working with a number of different government organizations and private sector organizations as well, essentially to make the economic case for nature, to bring in to recognize, to demonstrate, to capture the values of nature within decision-making. There's a number of very pithy ways to put it, which is to make nature's values visible. It's often one that we use to essentially make sure that nature has a seat at the decision-making table, to make sure that we count nature when it's being discussed in economic terms, and that's the language of decision makers. Really, that's it's how policymakers need to weigh up decisions. It's how private sector organizations need to convince their CEOs as well. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're trying to do, to fix the metrics by which food systems are assessed. I'm going to go very quickly through this, but essentially just to give you a bit more of an understanding of what we're trying to talk about, and that's that agriculture and food systems, in all its great diversity, in all of its very lengthy system, from before production, preparation, then cultivation, then processing and trading and retailing and consumption, and of course all of waste management. It's a whole system. It's a very, very complex system. But to give you something more synthesized and easy to understand, essentially what we're talking about is the interaction between human systems and natural systems. And we, in our economic systems, tend to value what we can see. So the work of human hands, if you like, the inputs that we put into the system, the irrigation, the fertilizer, pesticides, the labor that we put in, the machinery, etc. And we often see as well the fruits of that labor. So the food, the employment, the fuels, all of the different commodities that we get from our farms, and even agrotourism can be measured and is often included in economic systems. But what isn't generally measured and what often is overlooked is what's invisible. And that's often what we get from nature. So all of the things that are given to us for free, really, from the living world, and those are we term ecosystem services. So erosion control, soil formation, nutrient cycling, all of the ways in which the plants take up nutrients from the soil. That all happens without a single human hand doing anything about it. So our plants are actually farming for us. They're farming the micronutrients in the soil. So we're only doing half the work, really. And when I say we, of course, I mean the very hardworking farmers, not myself. Pest control, genetic diversity, pollination services, moderation of extreme events, so essentially means flood control, and the incredibly powerful strength of the mangrove forests, which are protecting the coastlines from major storms and tsunamis, etc. Lots of different systems that we don't count, lots of different services that we don't count within our agricultural systems, but are very, very important. And of course, there's the invisible impacts as well that we have on nature that we also don't account for. The fact that we're encroaching on habitats of different species, the fact that we're losing ecosystem complexity in many, many cases by monocultures. We're reducing the number of species out there. That's one of the greatest impacts of the food systems, that we're destroying biodiversity. Then soil erosion, etc., etc. There's a lot of different impacts which we're understanding better, but we're not including in the economic system. We're not counting for. We're not accounting for these. But then there's also invisible impacts on the human systems, which are also not included, which is all of the health impacts of unsustainable practices, all of the loss of cultural heritage, the loss of access to areas for recreation because of encroachment into natural spaces. Sorry, there's a lot of information in all of these slides, but I'm just going to let you read some of them and leave them on screen, but I can share the presentation with you later if I can manage to send it through the internet. So having told you a little bit about our program, again, I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to let you have an example of the work that we're doing at the moment. And I'm focused on rice ecosystems because they're so important to the whole of Asia and the whole of the area that I'm working in. There are billions of people relying on rice as a daily staple. It is life, it is culture, it is everything in many of the communities that I'm working with. Rice feeds them, it is their livelihood. And it's their major cultural and family experience, as well as eating around menus and diets related to rice. In Thailand, rice is very much a staple food, but it's also one of the biggest exporters of rice around the world as well. So rice is also a commodity. But it's a very, very interesting country in that the strength of the monsoons means that there's plentiful rains usually to be able to grow the crop of rice. Without irrigation. So unusually for the rest of the world, Thailand mostly is rain fed. So it's very much dependent on the climate and very much dependent on regular rain climatic systems. Now I wanted to give you some very pretty pictures of rice, and this is a very beautiful area in the north of Thailand, which is unusually growing rice on the hillside. That's very unusual in Thailand, not so unusual in the Philippines, but it's just somewhere that I thought would be possible to show you how rice is really part of a landscape. Agriculture is situated within different ecological niches. And traditionally, rice was always grown in these little small fields with what they call bunds. So these bunds, these bunds, which are barriers to keep the water in and to make a field that is manageable by one family or one group or one village. So these bunds are kind of manageable spaces that are also ecological niches. So you get different flowering plants on the bunds, you get different animals being able to fish for insects and other fish in the rice fields themselves. So it's a very, very interesting ecosystem. It goes from an entire wetland of water to dry land in the space of one growing cycle. It goes from very small crops, which are very widely spaced, to very densely spaced. It's a very, very interesting system I could talk far too long about. But it's, as I say, very dependent on weather and very dependent on climate change. I wanted to give you just a sense of the biodiversity in these rice fields just by playing this small clip. I hope you can hear it. I don't know whether you can see, but in the distance there are chickens running around. There's lots of frogs in the field, and there's lots of jungle nearby, which is a source of the water for the in the watershed. And there's obviously a lot of water flowing down the stream. This one, you think you can see, possibly, looking a bit more closely at all of the insects that are usually not visible in the film or not visible through the camera. But they're essential too. They're essential as eating the brown plant hopper, for example, which is one of the biggest enemies of the rice crop. And they're everywhere. In a very healthy field, you'll see them everywhere. They're the farmer's friend. And they're essential to the rice livelihood. We don't think of them, but those insects are absolutely essential to minimizing the use of other plant biocontrol chemicals, essentially. I wanted to put this picture in because most rice fields are actually not on the hills. Most are in the valley areas and most are flat, but you can still see the small bunds in between the rice fields, and you can see that there are ecological niches and there's a lot of diversity in the farming, at least in traditional rice farming. There's also rice in the city. This is just outside my house in Bangkok, which is, you can see there's a high rise behind, there's a few houses behind, but this is a tiny, tiny rice field, but it's productive all year round, and it's very healthy environment as well. This is the same rice field with its own ecological niches as well. Lots of birds around, lots of greenery as well, and different kinds of fruit trees, etc. But this is how rice is more normally in the mainstream production areas. So it's a monoculture, as you can see, vast expanses of rice and very few ecological niches. They've taken down most of the trees in between the rice fields, and there's very few other crops growing there. You do get some biodiversity, you do get birds visiting, and there is biodiversity in the fields, but much reduced compared with the images we saw earlier. So again, moving on rather quickly, I just want to touch very briefly on ecosystem services and what I mean by that. We mentioned them a bit earlier, but to systematize it a little bit, they're related to 4 different services. So services that provide, so clean water, provide fish, diversity, services of food, of wood, of fiber, etc. Regulating services which relate to moderating the climate, cultural services which relate to stewardship and aesthetic pleasure of being outdoors, the wonderful feeling that we have of being in nature, And supporting services which relate to everything we've been talking about, how the soil provides the stability and balance of our environment. And there again is another picture of a very diverse agricultural system that smallholder farmers tend to work with. I'm going to go very quickly through all of these different slides because they relate to all of the science involved in looking at these specific ecosystem services and what exactly in the rice system is needed to maintain those systems, etc. There's a lot going on. But we don't want to overlook the cultural services as well, the vast importance of rice systems within the identity and culture of the groups that we're working with in all of these countries. It is very much linked to spirituality in Thailand, as well as every other country that I've been to in Southeast Asia. Spirits are always very close to the rice field. The entire rice cycle is dominated by ceremonies to give respect to both the land, the water, and the rice plant itself, which are personified in different deities. And it is an entire system which is bound with the rhythms of life of local people. And there you have a picture of the bounty from one rice field up in the hills that I was working with. It really is, when people see rice, they don't just see the rice fruit, they see all of these other vegetables and fruits and insects and animals that they get, the fish and the shrimp and the crabs and everything that they get from the rice field. Very, very important to the whole system is the seeds. The seeds of the rice. These are collected and stored over generations and generations, millennia, really. There have been records of 10,000 varieties of rice just in Thailand alone. And though that variety, that diversity is vastly being diminished, and now there's very, very much fewer varieties being grown. But farmers like this one are very proudly still developing their own rice, and they develop their own rice breeds. And the way they do it is by planting them. They don't store it away and never seed it again. In order to maintain the life within the seed, they grow them, produce them, collect them, and then store them for a few years and then grow them again. And through maintaining that cycle, they maintain their knowledge and they maintain their ability to adapt to climate change, to adapt to different situations. And there you are, he's keeping them in his fridge. He knows what they are. These need to be kept cold because they're kept for more than 2 years. But that's because he's a plant breeder. He's very, very knowledgeable about these things. But most people will just keep the seeds for the next year, in fact. But slowly, people are beginning to promote that knowledge again, promote the skill in just selecting which are the right seeds to make sure you can grow. And rice is one of these incredibly bountiful crops. So you get 100-fold. You just you plant one bag of rice, and in a whole hectare you can get tons of rice from that. So there you have a few more images of the agritourism and more cultural aspects of rice systems. I don't want to go too much into everything because it's going to take a long time, but essentially just to pick out a few things, some of the threats to the ecosystem services that we currently face. Here you can see a very beautiful image of farmers' dream in terms of there's beautiful rice crops all at the same stage of development. There's no weeds in there, everything is the same height, everything is in soldier-like rows. And it's a monoculture, and this is what many farmers are told to see as the pinnacle of their achievement and their success in the mainstream system. But what you don't know or you don't see necessarily is that these crops are essentially produced by a whole set of chemicals and a whole set of agrochemicals including both fertilizers and pesticides. In Thailand, they quite often advertise the chemicals that they use in the field, just there in the field itself, in cardboard cutouts of the chemicals that we use. And it's partly subsidized advertising for the companies so that they get a little discount on their fertilizers, etc. But to me, it's shocking because it really shows the prevalence and the lack of concern that people have about putting in chemicals within the land and pesticides and essentially biocides into these systems, which traditionally used to produce so much food and so much life. But you see this all too commonly throughout the region. People spraying, this is spraying on the bunds rather than the fields, because the field is currently fallow and unproductive, but they're still spraying on the edges of the fields. This boy was spraying something likely to be pesticide. It smelled terrible, very, very bad. I was walking on that street behind. And it's very worrying that young boys are exposing themselves to these very harmful chemicals on a regular basis. He will have done not just that field, but many other fields as well. And you can see how close it is being sprayed to the community there. It's really very prevalent, and many people are very badly affected by dermal problems and also reproductive problems, and also a number of different health impacts from the use of the unregulated use of pesticides and herbicides. Just to go very quickly to show a little bit about the problem, the pesticides are greatly increasing in use, but the actual productivity of these pesticides is greatly falling in comparison to the amount that's being applied to the fields. So you don't actually get a commensurate gain in productivity. These rice fields, which used to be provide incredible diversity. There was a study in 1979, apparently, which recorded almost 600 species just in one rice field in Thailand, which is just quite incredible. And they can be such spheres for life, you know, but unfortunately, diversity is decreasing. On the left, you can see some pictures, which was from our research project, looking at the diversity of life in fields at the moment. And that might seem like quite a lot of diversity from our research project, but it's nowhere near 600 species, and it's you know, we haven't got to the report yet from that study, so we still are in the process of researching. But you know, the likelihood is that we have seen over time and over decades a steady decrease in biodiversity in the rice systems. Fertilizer also is another issue which has been climbing without commensurate gain in yield. So one of the big problems at the moment is that there's very little efficiency in nutrient take-up from application of fertilizer. And we see that the rice plant itself is not able to take up the use from these. You can see there the little dots of fertilizer in the rice plant there. And we need to find other ways to fix nitrogen into the soils, including through cover crops and nitrogen fixing plants. Fertilizer itself is one of the most energy intensive pre-production activities, and has a very, very large impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Just the production of fertilizer, and then on the application of fertilizer, you have problems of nitrous oxide emissions as well. You also have the problem of eutrophication, which is where the water is so filled with nitrogen that it produces algae, and that reduces the oxygen availability within the water itself. So it results in large scale fish kills. You see in lakes all over Thailand now this beautiful green color, but unfortunately it's not a healthy sign for the lakes. And there's a lot of research as well going on, which is showing that the nitrogen efficiencies are beyond optimism as well. So we have to find ways in which we can support farmers to produce, but without overweighing the system with unnecessary chemicals that are very expensive and very inefficient and potentially unhealthy and killing both biodiversity and affecting the health of the farmers too. I put here just at the end some indication of where the farmers stand within the value chain of the rice production system. And farmers, and this is farmers as a whole, not necessarily the small farmers, it includes both small farmers and large farmers, get only a small share of the rice value chain. But the seed farmers and the fertilizer companies and pesticide companies get a much higher share, and then there's some food manufacturers and the supermarkets as well. And this is based on research from Nepal, Pakistan, Vietnam, but it's it's a picture which is familiar in other countries as well. And so whether that's the right share of value, I think is something that you can see it's a very complex issue, it's a very complex question. But what I would say is that are the farmers able to both maintain a livelihood at the moment, but also into the long term? Are they depleting their resources in order to live today? But not able to continue to working tomorrow because the environment is so degraded and so unproductive. I'm going to put a rather depressing picture here of one field that we went to not so long ago, which is in an area that used to be very, very productive and very fertile, and the farmer just next door was saying that they used to produce from their rice fields not only the rice, etc., but they used to produce fish sauce as well, which is an essential ingredient in Thai cooking. And that sauce was made from the fish that they would find and that they would harvest from the rice field as well. But in the last few years, they haven't been able to, even there are no fish left in the nearby canal, which is on the other side of the picture. There were just no fish left, and they couldn't produce their fish sauce. And so of course now they have to buy it. It's not that expensive to buy fish sauce, but it's something that they were able to produce for themselves and also share with their community and also share with their family. But the fields, unfortunately, now look rather rusty and rather dry and barren. That will produce again. They will be able to produce through applying all sorts of fertilizer and chemicals, but it's a very degraded and very sad-looking field, which is it's in need of a lot of rehabilitation for it to produce more naturally again. There you can see a very dry field, which is just beginning to cover with green again. I'm not sure that this rice, I think, is just being left fallow. But you can see a spirit house there as well, to give some hope in this rather bleak picture. But again, this is just the last picture, just to show, despite the rather negative pictures of the last few slides, I just wanted to show that rice is still, there's still plentiful amounts. It's still the center of social society in Thailand. There's still, it's still the center of community. There's still a lot of diversity. You can see all of those different snacks and cakes provided, which all come from rice. There is still a lot that can be done. There's a lot of diversity still in the system, but we want to make sure that we can incorporate all of these different values into rice policy in Thailand and to sustain it for the long term. I apologize, I'm not sure if anyone could hear me, but that's what I prepared so far. I hope I didn't go over time.